In the freezing dark of February 1781, hundreds of exhausted American soldiers stumbled toward the banks of the Dan River, boots wrapped in rags, some marching barefoot on frozen mud, with Lord Cornwallis's army only hours behind them. If those boats were not there, the Continental Army in the South would cease to exist that night. Boats were waiting. Somehow, impossibly, boats were already waiting. Within hours, Nathanael Greene's entire army crossed to safety, and Cornwallis arrived to find nothing but empty water and a starving British army with nowhere left to go. This was not luck. This was the final piece of a trap, 6 brutal weeks in the making, a strategy so unconventional that Cornwallis never figured out how to counter it until his own army had been bled past the point of recovery. So how did a self-taught general with no formal military training outthink one of the most capable commanders in the British Army, without ever actually beating him outright? Nathanael Greene was an unlikely candidate for command. A Rhode Island ironworks owner and Quaker by upbringing, he had been expelled from his own congregation as a young man for attending a militia parade, and taught himself military theory from borrowed books by lamplight. He rose through sheer competence to become one of Washington's most trusted subordinates, serving as quartermaster general and mastering the brutal math of what an army could and could not sustain. By late 1780, the Southern cause was close to finished. Charleston had fallen that May. Over 5,000 Continental soldiers taken prisoner, the worst American defeat of the war. Cornwallis controlled Georgia and most of South Carolina outright. Congress had already tried Horatio Gates, whose army was shattered at Camden in a rout so complete that Gates fled the field on horseback and covered nearly 200 miles before stopping, ending his career. Washington had one name left to offer, and it stunned observers expecting someone more decorated. Greene arrived that December to find roughly 1,400 starving, poorly clothed men against a well-supplied, confident British force. Any reasonable general would have consolidated what little he had. Greene split his tiny army in two instead, sending 600 men west under Brigadier General Daniel Morgan, while keeping the rest to the east, deep inside hostile territory. His own officers were baffled, but Greene understood that Cornwallis's aggression, fixated on destroying the Southern army outright, would force him to split his attention between two tempting targets and be drawn deeper into hostile country, chasing an enemy that refused to fight on his terms. The bet paid off almost immediately. Cornwallis sent his most aggressive cavalry commander, Banastre Tarleton, with over 1,000 men to destroy Morgan's detachment. Morgan annihilated Tarleton's force at Cowpens in under an hour. Cornwallis, furious and humiliated, could either consolidate and concede momentum or chase Greene and Morgan deeper into the backcountry. He chose pursuit, walking directly into the second half of a trap weeks in the making. If you're enjoying this kind of tactical breakdown, take a second and subscribe. We cover the strategy and psychology behind history's greatest military campaigns every week, and Cornwallis's unraveling is only getting started. Cornwallis made a decision that revealed exactly how desperate the pursuit had become. To move faster, he ordered his own supply wagons burned, stripping his force down to only what soldiers could carry. Greene, meanwhile, had spent weeks scouting river crossings and road networks with obsessive precision. That groundwork became the entire foundation of what followed. The race to the Dan, a grueling 200-mile retreat across frozen country with Cornwallis's stripped-down army, sometimes only hours behind. Greene positioned a rear guard under Colonel Otho Williams to screen the withdrawal, skirmishing just enough to slow the pursuit without risking a full engagement. He arranged boats hidden at key crossings days in advance so that when his column reached the Dan in early February, they crossed in a controlled evacuation while Cornwallis's starving troops arrived to find nothing waiting for them. Stranded on the wrong side with an unsupplied army, Cornwallis withdrew to Hillsborough to resupply. Greene rested and reinforced before recrossing to shadow Cornwallis's weakened force, picking the ground for the confrontation both men knew was inevitable, a wooded area near a rural courthouse called Guilford. He arranged 3 defensive lines. The first, roughly 1,000 North Carolina militia, would fire 2 volleys and withdraw, the same tactic that had shattered Tarleton at Cowpens. The second, Virginia militia in dense woods, would slow and disorganize the advance further. The third, Greene's Continental regulars, would deliver the decisive blow once Cornwallis's men had already been bled by the 2 lines ahead of them. Cornwallis attacked on the morning of March 15, 1781, desperate to force the engagement that had eluded him for weeks. The British pushed through withering fire from the first line, absorbed brutal close-quarters combat through the woods against the second, and by the time his exhausted regiments reached the third line, they were a fraction of the force that had begun the assault. The fighting there turned so desperate that Cornwallis, watching his own infantry begin to buckle, ordered artillery to fire grape shot directly into the melee, tearing through his own men alongside the Americans. A decision that likely saved his line, but cost him dearly. Greene, recognizing that a prolonged fight risked losing the army he had spent months preserving, withdrew in good order rather than chase total victory. Cornwallis held the field. He also lost over a quarter of his entire force doing it, roughly 500 men, an army already starving from burning its own supply wagons weeks earlier. When news reached Parliament, Charles James Fox stood and delivered the verdict that defined the battle for history. Another victory like this one would ruin the British Army entirely. Greene never won a single major battle against Cornwallis outright. Cowpens was Morgan's victory. The race to the Dan was an escape, not a battle. Guilford Courthouse ended with Cornwallis technically holding the field. But Greene understood something Cornwallis never grasped. The British did not need to be defeated in battle. They needed to be bled and starved of resources they could not replace, while Greene's own army, fed by local support and reinforced by returning militia, simply endured. Greene had turned attrition itself into a weapon, using geography and his enemy's own aggression against him at every stage. Shattered and unable to sustain further operations, Cornwallis abandoned the Carolinas entirely and marched north into Virginia out of desperation rather than strategy, a march that ended at a tobacco port called Yorktown, where he was surrounded that October and the war effectively ended. The army that surrendered there was, in every meaningful sense, the same broken force that had been bleeding out since the Dan and Guilford Courthouse months earlier. Fabius Maximus wore down Hannibal's Carthaginian army the same way, refusing decisive battle and letting time and attrition do the damage direct confrontation never could. Greene applied that same cold logic across an entire theater, turning retreat, geography, and his enemy's own aggression into the mechanism of British defeat. Cornwallis spent the rest of his career trying to explain how a campaign of near constant tactical success in the Carolinas had somehow ended in catastrophe at Yorktown. The honest answer is that Greene never let him win a war he could actually afford to fight. The battlefield at Guilford Courthouse is a quiet park today outside Greensboro, North Carolina, where markers trace the lines through the trees. Visitors walk the same wooded paths where a general once expelled from his own faith for attending a parade outlasted one of Britain's finest field commanders without ever needing to beat him outright. If breakdowns like this are your thing, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. There's a lot more of this war left to cover, and it only gets sharper from here.